Our next speaker is Dr. Gill Plunkett, and the title of her talk, as you will see, is Contextualising the Human Past Through Pollen Analysis. Gill is an archaeologist and professor of paleoecology at Queen's University in Belfast. She specialises in reconstructing past environmental change, mainly through this pollen analysis, exploring how the people of the past interacted with their environment. She's also currently researching volcanic histories and the impacts of past eruptions, which is another fine tradition at Queen's. And of course, land use in prehistoric and medieval Ireland using the pollen. And this is the subject of today's talk, and I think exemplifies how the tiniest of remains can build the biggest of pictures. And of course, none are bigger or more topical than the environment, climate, and associated human actions. So, Gill, the fate of humanity rests on your shoulders. No pressure.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Sharon, as well, and to Una for the invitation to come and talk here, and for the excellent organisation and the patience as well at me getting my talk in at the last minute. I'm a bit of a last-minute person. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about pollen, and I realised when I was putting this talk together that it marks 2024 marks the anniversary, a few anniversaries, two of them of a personal nature and one of them relevant to pollen and archaeology. The first is that I started out as an archaeologist. I studied archaeology in UCD, but 30 years ago, in September just gone, I first went to Belfast to learn about pollen. So I went up to do my master's degree. 25 years ago, at the end of September, I submitted my PhD, and that PhD looked at how we could use pollen and other evidence to try and understand humans, climate, and the relationship between climate change and cultural change. So I looked at how climate change during the Bronze Age might have or didn't affect human activity and what we know about the archaeological record. The other anniversary I'll come on to during the talk. So to begin with, first of all, pollen. Most of you will know about pollen. I apologize if any of this is very, very basic, but just in case anybody doesn't have a background or an understanding of how pollen is applied in archaeology, I thought I would run through some of the basic principles. So pollen is produced by all flowering plants. It contains the male genetic information, and the plant will produce it in order to conduct fertilization. So the male part of a flower or a male flower will produce the pollen, and that pollen has to get to the female part of the plant to fertilize it and therefore produce a seed and reproduce. We can see pollen grains when we can see them en masse, like we can see with the sunflower here. The yellow dust is pollen grains. You can see lots of them. But individual pollen grains are extremely small, so we need a microscope to see them. Here you see a scanning electron microscope image that shows the structure of the pollen grains really well. There's an aesthetic to pollen grains, which makes counting pollen a particularly enjoyable experience. And it becomes automatic as well, so you can actually you have to stay at your microscope, but you can conduct conversations, you can listen to the radio, you can think about what you're going to have for dinner, whatever it might be, while doing it automatically. Now, we can't count pollen using a scanning electron microscope. That's a little bit advanced, but we can see them on a light microscope. And we can still see distinguishing features that allow us to say what plant it came from, because every plant produces pollen that has particular structural characteristics, and those characteristics enable us to link them back to the plants that produce them. The wall of the pollen grains is also composed of something called sporopollenin, which is one of the most resistant organic substances known, and it manages to resist decay, except in certain circumstances. So pollen is produced, as I said, by the male parts of the plants, and then it needs to get to the female parts of the plants or the female parts of other plants. And it does so by a number of mechanisms. Some plants are adapted to produce pollen that is dispersed by wind, so they produce a huge amount of pollen. The wind will carry it away, and it will hopefully land on another plant and contribute to the fertilization. Others are adapted to have insects come. The flowers are designed to attract insects, usually the colorful ones, the scented ones. The insects come along, collect the pollen, collect nectar, and then fly off to another plant and deposit that pollen onto the plant. So when we get pollen being produced by plants, some plants produce loads of it, some produce less, loads still, but less. Some are designed to have the pollen travel very long distances, and some not such long distances. So already we have a little bit of bias in the amount of pollen that can get into the fossilized record. The pollen grains, as I said, have different structures, and with a little bit of experience to identify what kind of plants produced it. So we can look at these and say which types of plants produced it. We've got heather up on the top left, pine up on the top right, for example. And just for comparison, I've included hair. So this is a microscopic image of a hair at the same magnification provided by my PhD student, Helen Essel. I told her I would give her a mention. And you can see the width of the pollen grains relative to the width of the hair. The largest pollen grain, the pine up here, is still narrower than the width of the hair. So you can fit many pollen grains across a strand of hair. They're very, very small. The pollen grain will blow around the landscape. Even the insect pollinated, the insect pollen gets blown around the landscape, and it will get deposited. So some of it won't end up on a flower, it will get deposited on the landscape. And certain types of landscapes are really good places to find pollen. Places that are wet are particularly good because the wet conditions reduces the amount of oxygen that's available in the environment, and that inhibits the microbia, bacteria, fungi, from eating the organic material in the sediment and therefore causing decay. So basically, wet environments inhibits the decay and the pollen gets preserved. Places like lakes and bogs are particularly good because the lake sediment is going to accumulate over long periods of time, or the peat is going to accumulate over centuries, over millennia. And in doing so, it's capturing pollen that was around in the landscape at different time periods. It's a continuous sequence. And it's that aspect of pollen analysis that I find particularly useful from an archaeological perspective. We can also take spot samples from an archaeological site, for example, and look for pollen. But if a soil is aerated, that process of decay is going to have happened, so the pollen might not be preserved. Ditch sediments can be quite good because they tend to be waterlogged, so we can get pollen out of ditches as well. But most pollen records go to environmental contexts such as lakes and bogs. And then we can take cores, so if there's an exposed section in a bog, we can sample that, or alternatively, we can core down and extract sedimentary cores, and we core down progressively as far as we can go, and extract lake sediment or extract peat. The stratigraphy reflects changes in that environment, and then we can look at the pollen contained within the sediment. So just to show, this is going to start by itself, what it's like to count pollen, we extract samples from the sediment, we treat it, we try to concentrate the pollen grains, and we put it onto, we put the sample onto a microscope slide, and then we count through, it's not working, oh, it is working. Okay, so we've got hazel over here, there's another grain, that's a heather, that's an alder, and then we scan forward. We can see here there's a pine grain, and then we get another heather, another alder hiding behind some debris. The other bits of things are bits of plant debris that are also present, so we have to find the pollen in amongst the grains. There we have another alder, that's a birch, that's another heather. This is from a bog, so there's plenty of heather. And then some more examples. Coming up to the grass. That's an oak. There's more heather. And then we have a polypodium spore. So polypodium is a fern. It doesn't produce, it's not a flowering plant. It'll produce spores, but we can identify the the spores, and we can count those. And there are also bits of charcoal that we can count in there as well that will tell us a little bit about fire history. So when we have a sedimentary sequence from a lake or a bog, these can go down meters, many, many meters. A typical raised bog will go back maybe 10, 12 meters. And we extract that. The longer the sequence, the more samples we're going to have to look at, because a sample typically represents about a cubic centimeter of material. So we take a centimeter material, which will represent some decades of sediment accumulation, depending on the type of material. We look at the pollen in that sample, and it can tell us about the vegetation that was growing at the time that sediment was accumulating. So, for example, in this sequence, this is a sequence from the bottom of a bog. The grey material represents clay that was accumulating at the end of the last ice age, and the pollen within it tells us about the relatively sparse vegetation that existed at that time. It would have been a landscape that would be similar to what we'd see in a tundra today. We go a little bit further up and we find evidence for the first forests developing after the Ice Age. These would have been birch forests, and they quickly colonized and were able to grow. But as the climate continued to warm up, we get the arrival of hazel and pine, and the very first settlers, post-glacial settlers of Ireland, would have experienced an environment like this, where the forests were dominated by hazel and pine. Oak and elm subsequently came along, became the main elements of the broadleaf forest, but they emerged over a period of centuries and arrived a little bit later. If we keep going up the sequence, we get closer and closer to present, and at one point we start to see that there's evidence for disturbance in the vegetation. We see the forests being opened up, being cleared, and this marks the beginning of the farming period. Mesolithic people probably did cut vegetation, cut trees, make use of various different plants, but the impact they had on the vegetation was relatively small, at least from a pollen perspective. Some people have said that they can identify Mesolithic impacts in the vegetation, but it's so subtle, it's really difficult to be sure it was Mesolithic impact rather than, for example, a storm event that caused trees to fall down. But whatever Neolithic people did when they started farming and clearing the landscape, this left a very, very clear mark in the pollen record. So we see evidence for the trees declining, grasses increasing, all sorts of herbs who don't produce a huge amount of pollen or who don't distribute a lot of pollen. These become better represented. We see the first evidence for cereals as well, and other weeds associated with crop fields. So by looking at a sequence of samples through a sedimentary record, we can reconstruct what the vegetation was like in the past and how that changed through time, and we can try to identify why it changed through time. So the formatting has gone a little bit awry with the presentation, but basically what the other anniversary that I was going to mention is hidden here underneath the title, but 90 years ago there was a seminal paper published that marks a real development in the application of pollen to archaeology. The two of them have been used together for a very long time, and Ireland has an extremely good record of doing so. In 1934, the Committee for Quaternary Research in Ireland published this paper outlining what the committee was, what the different members were doing, and how much we could learn about the past by combining the study of natural sciences, geology, and archaeology to understand the past environment. If anybody's not familiar with the term quaternary, it relates to the last 2.6 million years, essentially the period in which we've got ice ages and warm periods. And amongst this committee were archaeologists, as I said, but the natural scientists had identified that there was interesting work being conducted in Scandinavia, and they decided to invite Knud Jessen over from Denmark to conduct some pollen analysis. It wasn't the first pollen analysis undertaken in Ireland. Gunnar Ertmann had been over and had already demonstrated that pollen analysis could be applied, and we've got lots of places where we can go to conduct this. But the committee put together some money. They put some of their own money in to ensure that Jessen could come over and visit them and undertake investigations across the island of Ireland. Amongst the archaeologists, I'll mention Adolf Marr. In today's cancel culture, Marr probably wouldn't get a mention because this paper was published in 1933. The committee had met in 1934. The committee had met in 1933. In 1933, Marr had joined the Nazi Party. He was leading the Irish branch of the Nazi Party. But he headed the museum, the National Museum of Ireland, and he made important contributions. Interesting, I came across this paper when I was doing my PhD. I was writing up my PhD, and I needed to go to part of the library where a lot of rare books were kept under lock and key. So you'd have to request the volume, and then you would need to sit in the room, and they would bring you the volume. I had accidentally requested the wrong volume of a journal, and while they were gone back to get me a copy of it, I spotted this paper on the shelf, and I picked it up and started reading it. And in it, there was a quote from Marr saying that one day he could foresee how the study of past environments would help us understand archaeology and the movement of people really well. And it just basically summarized what my PhD was about. So I found that particularly interesting. Anyhow, so by this stage, they realized that archaeology and the study of past environments could go hand in hand. People had been studying the environmental records in Scandinavia and had been recognizing that there were changes that were represented in lots of sequences, indicating that it wasn't something localized that was happening, it was something regional. And similar changes were being recognized in Irish bogs. So they could recognize that climate of the post-glacial period had changed through time, and this had left its mark on the paleoenvironmental record. Of course, in the 1930s, they didn't have any way of dating anything. The radiocarbon hadn't been developed. So one of the ways in which they dated when these changes happened was when they could identify archaeological remains in the bogs. If they could find an archaeological object, and they knew it dated to the Bronze Age, and they could see when the events were happening, they could identify that the change was happening in the Bronze Age, or before the Bronze Age, or after the Bronze Age. So already archaeology and paleoenvironment were starting to complement each other and provide information that was useful for both parties. So this map marks the map from Jessen's paper. The war broke out. There was a huge amount of work involved in looking at these. And the paper wasn't published until 1949. But you can hopefully see the yellow stars that indicate the extent of the sites investigated by Jessen. This is a huge undertaking. I don't think any paleoenvironmentalist has studied quite so many sites since. 49 sites altogether across the island. But just to show for comparison, this is a record from the Irish Pollen database indicating the amount of sites that have been studied across Ireland since then, including Jessen's work and Frank Mitchell's work. So the island has been extremely well covered by paleoenvironmental research. So that was the standing about 10 years ago. There have been even more studies since. So we have a huge amount of information from all of these sites that give us an idea of what was happening with the vegetation record, the natural vegetation record across the island since the last ice age, and what has been happening in terms of human impact on the vegetation since. So one of the studies undertaken by Jessen was in relation to this cauldron from Oldcroghan and County Monaghan. So the paper was the cauldron was published by Adolf Marr, but Jessen had undertaken a study of the pollen record. It was quite a rudimentary record. So this is the record. It shows the stratigraphic sequence, the position of the cauldron, and a number of samples were taken above and below where the cauldron had been found. So Jessen looked at 6 samples and only identified the trees. They were only identifying a small number of pollen types at this time. There wasn't a huge amount that could be said about this, apart from the fact that pine was absent. Let's see if I can get the pointer to work. So there's no pine, and the absence of pine is interesting because we know that about 4,500 years ago, pine disappears from the Irish landscape, apart from in the west of Ireland. So the one thing Jessen could say is it dates to sometime after in the last 4,000 years or so. But from his knowledge of the vegetation record, he ventured that it was probably deposited in the Iron Age. That was his interpretation, which was pretty well, presuming it is an Iron Age cauldron. I don't know if it's been independently dated. So individual types of pollen, basically. At this level, the oldest level, you can see how much willow is present, how much hazel is present. Hazel is always the most abundant type in an Irish pollen record, and how these change through time. In Adolph Marr's paper, he compared the ultratate cauldron to another one from County Longford, and this item allows me to segue neatly onto the first case study that I'm going to present to you. When students or members of the public ask me, what is the best find I ever discovered, I say this. So this is a find when I was working with the Irish Archaeological Wetland Unit in 2000, we were surveying Tor Bog in County Westmeath. We hadn't been finding very much, and we were training up people in field workers to identify bog archaeology at the time. And I was walking along one side of the drain, and the person I was training was the other, chatting away because there was nothing much to see. And then I said, hang on, is that something over there? So this is what you can see. You may be able to see some wood here. You may see some wood here, and you may see that it has a rounded edge. And I was like, wow, there's something unusual here. This isn't your average bog trackway. Of course, we looked at it, cleaned it up a bit, and I thought, cauldron, really cool, right? Barry Raftery would be so happy. Yeah, it wasn't a cauldron, but it did turn out to be a beautiful wooden vessel, subsequently dubbed the Pallasboy vessel in recognition of the townland it's from. You can see it here. The outside, this edge had been damaged by the machine when the ditch was being dug, but the other side contains a handle, and hence you see my comparison with this item. And it's a beautiful carved piece of alder wood that has been damaged, unfortunately. It was about 0.5 meter below the bog surface at the time, and the weight of the machinery, the turf cutting machinery, had damaged the cauldron, so it had collapsed in relatively recent times, we think. We could talk about the cauldron, but I'm going to move on and talk about the pollen record. The reason why the Monaghan vessel is of interest is that it wasn't a classic cauldron either. It's also an elongated vessel, so similar kind of style. So in we have the drain face with the exposed vessel, and before the excavation of the vessel took place, we recorded the peat stratigraphy. And you can see peat stratigraphy is normally quite flat. You get different types of peat and plant remains in relatively horizontal layers. But in this case, you can see the peat stratigraphy is a bit messed up. Now, it's difficult to know from this whether it's messed up because originally the vessel was intact and subsequently the machinery has caused a collapse of the vessel and the peat has slumped, or whether this was a cut feature. So we took a block sample of peat away from the vessel, hoping that this would be an undisturbed location and that we could use this for paleoenvironmental investigation. So this is a brief summary of the pollen record. So even pollen specialists don't like when a pollen record is put up in a presentation. So this is a simplified one. I've lumped all the trees and shrubs together. Isn't this working? The grasses and the herbs, because these are really good indicators of forest clearance and human activity, and I've left charcoal in there. And what the record shows is that there was a lot of trees and shrubs until this point here, which would correspond to the beginning of the late Bronze Age, and we get an increase in grasses and an increase in herbs, indicating quite substantial clearance of trees. In a modern open landscape, we would still have about 30% tree pollen. So we're getting down to 40%, vast amount of clearance taking place in this area. The level of the vessel is represented by the stippling, and we got some radiocarbon dates that indicated that this dates to the Iron Age, so essentially contemporary with the vessel, maybe a little bit later. But the presence of grit in the peat indicated that this was not an undisturbed location because we wouldn't expect grit to be in a bog. There's no reason for the grit to get there unless it's carried there. Now, this kind of implies, from reading this pollen record as if it's a normal pollen record, this would imply that the landscape was opened up in the late Bronze Age and continued to stay open until the Iron Age. and then you get forest regeneration. And from what we know about other pollen records, that would be extremely unusual because usually we get a period of forest regeneration between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Now, it's not impossible that it remained open, but another factor indicates that something is awry here, with two other factors. One, the pollen record changes quite abruptly at this point. That's a bit unusual. But two, the peat accumulation seems to be unusually slow. So if we work out how many centimeters we have between these two dated points, how many years are represented, it seems as if the peat is accumulating much, much slower than what we normally see. In a typical bog, a centimeter depth of peat would be 10 years, maybe 15 or 20 years in a very drained bog. This bog wasn't drained for very long, so we would expect a rate of maybe 15 years a centimeter. And therefore, we should have had a lot more peat accumulating. My interpretation of this record is that effectively the peat had been disturbed, maybe cut, maybe taken away, perhaps to create a pool environment, and the vessel was deposited in the bog at that location. That's a little tricky one. It's a bit of an unusual case, but it suggests that there was modification of the bog before the vessel was put in. That allows me to move on to another find. So this is the location of the Pallasboy vessel in Tor Bog, Oldcroghan Hill. So we're in County Offaly. I didn't mention we're in County Offaly now. Oldcroghan Hill is a high point in the landscape in this area, an old volcanic edifice. And to the south, we've got Clonurl Bog, which was the location where Oldcroghan Man was discovered. If you're familiar with Oldcroghan Man, this is a bog body whose head had been decapitated and who had been cut at the torso. So only his torso and his arms had been placed into the bog. So as well as being decapitated and de-legged, he'd also had holes punched in his arms and withies put through them. So quite a lot of effort putting in to ensuring this bog body was put into the ground. When the body was discovered, it was in a digger bucket. It wasn't noticed until the ditch had been dug in the bog. So we knew roughly where the bog body came from, but not the precise level in the peat that he derived from. So the National Museum organised an excavation, and they opened up 2 trenches either side of the ditch in order to be able to come in and collect some paleo-environmental samples. So here you see the trenches and monolith, which is a block sample taken from each drain face. Then they excavated down the bulk between the trenches and the ditch, and in doing so, they discovered fingernails. Some of the fingernails had become detached and were still in the peat, which gave them the precise point at which the body had, at least the hands, were before the body was disturbed. And then they sent samples of peat attached to those fingernails to me. I knew to look at the monolith over here, which was closest to where the find spot of the nails had been. And then I compared the information from both of them. So this is the pollen record from the sequence itself, from the monolith. You can see it's mainly dominated by trees. Towards the bottom, we've got evidence for lots of grasses, some cereals, and lots of herbs. This is indicating an extremely open landscape, similar to what we saw at Tor Bog next to the vessel, and similar to what we see at lots of pollen records. So in the Bronze Age, there was lots of forest clearance. It's not evident at all sites, but it's evident at many sites. So extensive clearance at this point. Then, as we come into the latter part of the late Bronze Age and continuing through into the beginning of what's now the early Iron Age, we see trees increase, so there's some forest regeneration. Elm comes back. Elm had been missing from the bottom of the record. Elm grows on good soils, and the significance of elm will become apparent shortly. The grasses decrease, but they're still quite elevated, and similarly, the herbs decrease, and there's also still some cereals represented. This is indicating that there's still human activity going on in the area, the pollen's blowing in from the wider area, but it's not as intense as it had been in the earlier phase. So this is what we should have expected to see at Tor, because it's only a few kilometers away. As we come into the the end of the developed Iron Age, the end of the early Iron Age through to the beginning of the developed Iron Age, we see trees increasing further and essentially grasses declining, elm is increasing, cereals are all but disappearing, suggesting that there wasn't much human activity at this time. The landscape had become vegetated again with forests. And then when we come into the developed Iron Age, we see a decrease in trees, not as extensive as in the late Bronze Age, an increase in grasses, and cereals come back and herbs increase. Heather is also increasing, which is indicating that the bog itself is getting drier. So this gives us a record of the changing landscape in the surrounding area, and it allows us to contextualize what was happening at the time of the bog body. The bog body is dated to somewhere between 3,600 and 200, so somewhere in this time interval the body is being deposited. But there is the question about whether the body was deposited on a contemporary bog surface or buried in a feature similar to what might have happened with the Pallasboy vessel. So I looked at the pollen samples from the nails, extracted, it was a rather large sample, so I extracted 3 to look for variability within them. And you can see that they've got nearly 90% tree pollen, elm is abundant, and there's plenty of grasses and plenty of herbs. So I go back to the main pollen record and basically try to find out at what point in this diagram do those pollen samples, do the nail pollen samples look similar to the long record. And we can see that they correspond to this period when we've got almost complete forest regeneration, with elm values recovered to high points and the evidence for human indicators relatively low. But that's spanning a period of somewhere after 600 BC to 300 BCE. So it's quite a wide time span. So it doesn't tell us a huge amount of information, but we have some other information available to us, and that is what plant remains are present in the peat sequence. So the bog is made up of partly decomposed plant remains, mainly mosses, and there's one particular moss that is the main moss we find in Irish bogs up until the late medieval period, called Sphagnum austini. And under a microscope, this is what the cell structure of that sphagnum looks like. It's really easy to identify. So that's what's present in most of the sequence of the monolith, except when we get increases in Sphagnum cuspidatum, a little increase here, and a large increase in Sphagnum cuspidatum at this point. And Sphagnum cuspidatum is a type of moss, a sphagnum moss, that grows in wet places. We call it pool peat because it's often present as a floating mat in open areas of water on the bog. It has a different cell structure and it indicates a change towards a wetter bog surface. So we also look, and at the top we see an increase in heathers, which is an indicator of a drier bog surface. So we have we can compare the samples of plant macrofossils from the nails to the samples from the monolith, and we find that these a large amount of cuspidatum and a smaller amount of austini is present, and that means that those nail samples correspond to either this peak in cuspidatum or this peak in cuspidatum. So we've got 2 potential places for the nail samples to correspond to. We put this together, we put the pollen information and the plant macrofossil information together. This is the time span that the pollen would suggest the nails correspond to. This is what we get from the plant macrofossil samples, and together the 2 pieces of information say that this is the level at which the nails are corresponding to in the peat sequence. So we've got it narrowed down to a period of between about 360 to 300 BCE. The pool peat tells us the body was placed in a pool, so that we can be absolutely sure. And the insect analysis and the study of the bog body itself shows that the body was never attacked by insects. If it had been on an exposed on the bog surface, insects, flies, etc., would have come in and started eating away at the flesh. There was no evidence for that. So it looks as if the body was placed in the bog pool and kept in the bog pool and not exposed to insect attack. There's no evidence that the sequence was disturbed, that this seems to have been a natural pool that had formed already, or that was in the process of forming, and the body was placed into it. The pollen record allows us to see what was happening in the landscape at the time the body was being deposited. So we can see it's happening at a time when the landscape was not being used. The surrounding area was not being heavily used by individuals. It was a mainly forested environment, but it was before the area does become cleared, which gives us an idea of for whatever reason the individual was being killed and placed in the body, it wasn't associated with an area of extensive land use at this time, but the area subsequently became used for agriculture. To conclude then, Ireland has a particularly long record of using pollen analysis in conjunction with paleo-environmental analysis. Nowadays, when we're trying to get research funding, we're being told that we have to stress how interdisciplinary our work is. We need to bring different ways of looking at things together to try and find new ways forward. We have a long tradition of doing this. Archaeology, particularly in a place like Ireland, is already very interdisciplinary. Pollen analysis can shed a huge amount of information on a huge amount of light on all sorts of things. I've only given you some examples. There are so many other case studies I would have liked to draw on, but time is limited. Although pollen analysis can be applied to archaeological sites, I would argue that the best records are often away from the archaeological sites, but in reasonable proximity to them, because it allows us to see what was happening in that area on a longer term basis. I'm listening to the other talks and I'm thinking, I'm spotting the bugs in your maps and going, well, if we had a record from that, we'd be able to find out maybe about the pollution caused by the shooting of lead balls, for example. We can combine the information with that. I'd also be interested in finding out how much of the landscape was forested, for example. And most particularly, the long records allow us to put the construction or the occupation or the use of a particular archaeological site into a longer time perspective. So we can find out what was happening before this site was settled, what was happening while it was being settled, what was happening after it was being settled. And maybe that will shed light on why that activity took place at that particular location in the past. So that is me. Thank you very much for your attention. And I should also thank the Irish Archaeological Wetland Unit for the wonderful times we had on the bogs, recording the archaeology, and the National Museum as well for allowing me to participate in the Bog Body project. Thank you.